Middle Way Philosophy, Introductory Video 6G, Authenticity, Making Autonomous Individual Judgments, by Robert M. Ellis. What is authenticity? It means very much the same as genuine individuality, or autonomy. It means making decisions that are genuinely our decisions. It doesn't mean denying the influence of others on us, but that we do actually process and consider the judgments that we make, and thus make them our own judgments. Much can be said about authenticity from the perspective of middle way philosophy and of integration. This video is thus part of the series on integration. In the previous videos in this series, integration has been illustrated by the story of the two mules. Two mules that are in conflict, opposed to each other, but then reconsider the basis of that conflict and thus enter a more harmonious relationship, working together. The two mules can represent the process of integration, both within ourselves, between different impulses, and of course between different people or even different nations. Overcoming conflict through integration creates energy that we find within our own experience once we overcome those conflicts within ourselves. If you think about it, one of the main reasons why we end up with limitations on our energy is because of conflicts, because we're spending a lot of the energy we normally have keeping down part of ourselves, maintaining inner conflicts instead of uniting to deal with whatever conditions there are around us. So we can be authentic to the extent that we've united our energies and overcome those conflicts. We can show that in the context of other people, in our responses to others. For example, in being completely there for our children, responding to them authentically, rather than looking at our mobile phones every few seconds. Or we can be authentic in the sense of being able to gather all our intellectual, moral and aesthetic resources. For example, being able to produce genuinely original art. That is, art that we have produced as an individual, that there's more of us in it. An authentic person is able to be creative by not having undue anxiety about what other people think. They can take account of what other people think. It's part of the totality of influences upon them. But they're nevertheless able to make their own judgments because the totality of them, or more of them, is involved in that judgment. The challenge to authenticity comes from absolutisation, or metaphysical beliefs, whether implicit or explicit. The reason for that is that absolute beliefs block the integration process, which enables us to become more genuinely individual. Filled with anxiety about the power of this belief that we hold, whether it's associated with a strong group or an authority, or even if it's only internally held, we're unable to engage with the rest of ourselves, with the other parts that we are in the process repressing. In the state of repression created by absolute beliefs, one part of ourselves keeps the other in a state of frozen fear, where we're unable to unite our energies, we're unable to engage in the relationship to our bodies and our whole creative faculties in the way in which we would be able to if we were more united. Repression can take the form of rigid self-control, or on the other hand, it could take the form of letting oneself go. But either way, we're no longer responsible for ourselves, because with rigid self-control, we've taken some external authority or some group expectation and made ourselves conform to it. Similarly, in a state of letting ourselves go. We've rebelled against such a voice. We've repressed it in turn. We've engaged in a kind of counter-cultural, counter-repression. Either way, it's the middle way that we need, a kind of balance in order to find an authentic, a responsible, integrated approach to things. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher from the mid-20th century, was one of the main figures who discussed authenticity. And it was he who recognized the close relationship between authenticity and responsibility. For him, responsibility didn't just consist of responsibility to some kind of authority where the criteria or the rules were already laid down for us. On the contrary, responsibility in an authentic sense involves taking responsibility for the criteria themselves, for the rules that we follow. By adopting the rules, we make them valuable. One of Sartre's most interesting examples is what he called the Anguish of Abraham, Abraham being the figure from Genesis in the Old Testament. Abraham was commanded by God, as he believed, to sacrifice his son Isaac. It was only at the very last moment that Abraham, about to kill his son, was told by an angel to refrain from doing so and to kill an animal instead. Now, Sartre's view of this was that it reveals a lot about the nature of responsibility on the one hand, authentic responsibility, as opposed to what he called bad faith, which is pretending that we don't have responsibility. If Abraham really believed that the voice of God required him to kill his own son and was prepared to go ahead with that, that would be an example of bad faith, because he wasn't taking responsibility for the fact that he was interpreting what he believed to be the voice of God, that he was actually responsible for the criteria or the rules that he was using. Of course, such bad faith was not uncommon in Abraham's time. But in order to have an authentic response to a situation like that, it's not so much that one needs to avoid a particular kind of action, as that one needs to recognize that one is oneself taking on the responsibility, taking on the criteria or the rules that one applies in that situation. If one believes that the voice of God is telling us to do such and such, well, we have done that. We have accepted it as the voice of God. It's our judgment that's involved. That seems to take us to the heart of what is meant by authenticity. But it should be clear from this that it's not simply a matter of being individualistic or of rejecting authority that makes us authentic. Authenticity arises from finding a space in between authority and the rejection of authority, a more integrated space where more of ourselves can be applied. It's not necessarily the case that figures like Johnny Rotten, for example, countercultural icons, just because they reject authority, are necessarily authentic. We would need to judge that on an individual case-by-case basis, rather than assuming that they are necessarily authentic. It's quite possible to set up an opposed group and to obey the authority of the opposed group, rather than becoming more integrated as a reaction against traditional kinds of authority. So, to summarize, authentic individual judgment is integrated judgment. By overcoming conflicts in ourselves, to whatever extent we manage to do that, we become less prone to dominance by others, and thus more able to make genuine individual judgments of our own. The challenge to authenticity comes from absolutisation, usually associated with groups and authorities, whether those are strongly influenced from beyond ourselves or whether they're largely a voice within ourselves. Inauthentic, bad faith judgment avoids responsibility for the values we use. It just involves taking what we assume to be a required set of rules or required criteria from somewhere else. An individualistic overreaction against the group, a countercultural reaction, can also be inauthentic. So overall, authenticity is thus dependent on the practice of integration and the middle way. In other words, the discussions of authenticity that we find in such philosophers as Jean-Paul Sartre can perhaps be more fully fulfilled if we consider more closely what the practice of integration and the middle way involves. So to consider that not just intellectually, but also in practice.